Asterisk if this story touches your heart today, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more stories that remind us of the goodness still present in our world. Asterisk. The envelope trembled in Margaret Wilson's weathered hands as she stared at the final notice. 63 years old, widowed for just 8 months, and now facing eviction from the only home she'd known for 4 decades. Outside, the autumn rain tapped against the windows of her small farmhouse like an impatient creditor, while inside, the silence of loneliness was broken only by her shallow breathing and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors that Thomas had promised to fix before his heart gave out on that ordinary Tuesday morning. She placed the notice on the kitchen table beside a stack of unpaid medical bills and a framed photograph of Thomas in his army uniform, his smile still as bright as the day they'd met. The roof had begun leaking 3 weeks ago, right above the bedroom they'd shared for 39 years. Each night since, she'd placed a collection of pots and buckets to catch the water, the rhythmic dripping becoming a melancholy lullaby that accompanied her into fitful sleep. Tomorrow, a man named Jack Henderson would arrive to assess the roof damage. The neighbor who'd recommended him had mentioned he was fair with his prices, but fair prices meant nothing when your bank account held less than $200 and no prospect of more coming in. Social Security barely covered food and utilities, and Thomas's pension had died with him. Margaret wiped away a tear and straightened her shoulders. She would face tomorrow with the dignity Thomas had always admired in her. She would explain her situation to this Jack Henderson and ask if perhaps they could work out some kind of payment plan. And if not, well, she would cross that bridge when she came to it. The knock came precisely at 9 the next morning. Margaret had been awake since 5, tidying the house as best she could, brewing a pot of coffee she couldn't afford to share, and rehearsing what she would say to the contractor. Jack Henderson was not what she had expected. In her mind, she'd pictured someone older, perhaps with the same world-weary expression she saw in her own mirror each morning. Instead, standing on her porch was a man in his early 40s with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and hands that looked like they knew honest work. "Mrs. Wilson?" he asked, removing his cap. "I'm Jack Henderson. I understand you've got some trouble with your roof." Margaret nodded, gesturing for him to come inside out of the drizzle. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Henderson. The leak is upstairs. I can show you." She led him through the house, past the faded wallpaper and the photographs chronicling a life well lived with the man she'd loved. Jack followed silently, his eyes taking in the bucket's position strategically around the bedroom, the water stain spreading across the ceiling like dark continents on a pale map. "It started small," Margaret explained, her voice steady despite the knot in her throat. "Just a drip or two during heavy rain. But it's gotten worse with each storm." Jack nodded, examining the ceiling with practiced eyes. "Mind if I take a look up in the attic? And then I'll need to get up on the roof." "Of course," Margaret replied, showing him to the attic access in the hallway. While Jack inspected the damage, Margaret returned to the kitchen and stared out the window at the overgrown garden Thomas had once kept so meticulously. The roses he'd planted for their 30th anniversary were struggling against the encroaching weeds, much like she was struggling against the encroaching reality of her situation. When Jack returned, his expression was grave but kind. "Mrs. Wilson, you've got some significant damage up there. Several of the support beams have rotted through, and a large section of the roof will need to be replaced entirely." Margaret's heart sank, but she nodded, bracing herself for what was coming next. "I can give you an estimate," Jack continued, pulling out a notepad. "But I'll be honest with you, this isn't a small job." He wrote down some figures, did some calculations, and then slid the notepad across the kitchen table. The number at the bottom made Margaret's breath catch. It might as well have been $1 million. She began, her voice faltering. She squared her shoulders and looked Jack directly in the eyes. "Mr. Henderson, I appreciate your time, but I should have been upfront with you. I can't pay you. Not this amount. Not even close." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with shame and desperation. Margaret waited for him to gather his things and leave, perhaps with a sympathetic nod or an awkward apology. Instead, Jack surprised her. "Mrs. Wilson, did your husband serve?" Confused by the change in subject, Margaret nodded. "Yes. Thomas was in the army. 2 tours in Vietnam." Jack's eyes moved to the photograph on the table. "My father served in Vietnam. Never talked much about it, but I know it shaped who he was." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Tell me about your husband." And so, over the coffee she'd brewed that morning, Margaret found herself telling this stranger about Thomas, about his laugh that could fill a room, his dedication to their community, how he'd taught woodworking at the high school for 30 years, and how he'd fought his illness with the same quiet courage he'd shown in everything else. Jack listened, really listened, in a way few people had since Thomas died. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, then said, "I think I understand why this house means so much to you." "It's all I have left of him," Margaret admitted. "But I understand business is business, Mr. Henderson." Jack tapped his fingers on the table, then made a decision. "Here's what I'm going to do, Mrs. Wilson. I'm going to fix your roof." "But I just told you." "I heard you," he interrupted gently. "And I'm still going to fix it. No charge." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because it's the right thing to do," Jack said simply. "And because I can. My business is doing well enough that I can afford to help someone who needs it." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I can't accept charity, Mr. Henderson." "It's not charity," Jack insisted. "It's community. It's what neighbors do for each other. It's what your husband would have done if he were in my position." Margaret couldn't argue with that. Thomas had always been the first to help anyone in need. Besides, Jack continued with a small smile, "I could use some help with something else. My daughter is struggling with her history class. Your neighbor mentioned you were a history teacher before you retired." Margaret nodded, wiping away a tear. "For 35 years. Maybe you could tutor her once a week? That would be payment enough for me." Before Margaret could respond, Jack stood up. "I'll be back tomorrow with my crew. We'll get started on that roof before the next big storm hits." True to his word, Jack returned the next day with 3 other men. They worked tirelessly, removing the damaged sections of the roof, replacing rotted beams, and installing new shingles. The sound of hammers and saws filled the house that had been too quiet for too long. On the 3rd day, while the men worked, Margaret baked cookies using a recipe Thomas had always loved. When she brought them out to the workers, she noticed Jack examining the sagging front porch steps. "Those are next on my list," he said when he caught her looking. "After we finish the roof." "Mr. Henderson," Margaret protested, "the roof is more than generous. I can't let you." "Jack," he corrected her. "And it's no trouble. The steps won't take long." But it didn't stop with the steps. Over the next few weeks, Jack and his crew fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom, replaced the broken window in the guest room, and repaired the back door that hadn't closed properly in years. Each time Margaret tried to protest, Jack would simply smile and say, "Community, Mrs. Wilson. Just community." And each week, Jack's daughter Lily would arrive for her history tutoring session. The girl was bright and curious, reminding Margaret of why she'd loved teaching. Soon, their sessions expanded beyond history to include literature and writing. Lily's grades improved, and Margaret found herself looking forward to their time together. Word of Jack's kindness spread through the small town. Others began to stop by, a neighbor with a casserole, the local grocery store owner with extra produce, the librarian with books she thought Margaret might enjoy. The widow who had felt so alone found herself surrounded by community again. One evening, as autumn gave way to winter, Jack stayed after his crew had left. He sat with Margaret on the newly repaired porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. "Why did you really help me, Jack?" Margaret asked, the question that had lingered in her mind for weeks finally finding voice. The truth. Jack was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. When I came back from Afghanistan, I was lost. My marriage had fallen apart while I was deployed, I was struggling with what I'd seen over there, and I couldn't seem to find my footing. Margaret listened, surprised by this revelation. One day, I was at the hardware store, trying to figure out how to fix a plumbing issue in my apartment. I was frustrated, broke, and about ready to give up on everything. This older man noticed me struggling and offered to help. Spent 2 hours showing me what to do, then refused to take any payment. Jack turned to look at Margaret. That man was your husband. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas? Jack nodded. He didn't just show me how to fix a pipe that day. He showed me there was still good in the world when I'd started to doubt it. He talked to me about purpose and service. He's the reason I started my contracting business, focusing on helping veterans and their families. Tears streamed down Margaret's face as Jack continued. I never got to thank him properly. When your neighbor mentioned a widow named Wilson with a leaky roof, I wondered if it might be the same Wilson. When I saw his picture in your house, I knew. He never mentioned it, Margaret whispered. That doesn't surprise me, Jack smiled. He didn't strike me as a man who needed recognition for doing what was right. Margaret wiped her tears away. No, he wasn't. So you see, Jack said gently, I'm not doing this for you. I'm repaying a debt to the man who changed my life when I needed it most. As winter melted into spring, Margaret's house transformed. Not just physically, though the repairs Jack and others had made had restored it to its former glory, but spiritually. What had been a mausoleum of memories became a living tribute to Thomas's legacy. The garden bloomed again, tended now by Margaret and several neighborhood children who delighted in her stories and cookies. The kitchen that had been silent for so long rang with laughter as Margaret taught Lily and her friends how to bake Thomas's favorite recipes. Jack continued to stop by, sometimes to fix something, sometimes just to check in. His friendship became a comfort Margaret hadn't realized she needed. 1 year after their first meeting, Jack arrived with a special gift, a handcrafted wooden bench for the front porch, made from plans he'd found in Thomas's workshop in the garage. He had the design all drawn up, Jack explained as they sat on it together. Looks like he was planning to build it before he got sick. Margaret ran her hand over the smooth wood, feeling Thomas's presence in every curve and joint. It's perfect. Mrs. Wilson, Jack said, using the formal address he still sometimes fell back on, I want to thank you. Thank me? Margaret laughed. After everything you've done? Yes, Jack nodded seriously. What started as me repaying a debt has become something much more. Seeing how you've opened your home and heart to this community, how you've helped Lily find her confidence, you've taught me as much as Thomas did. Margaret reached over and squeezed his hand. We helped each other, Jack. That's what community is about. As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset from Thomas's bench, Margaret reflected on the journey of the past year. From the depths of despair and the shame of that whispered confession, I can't pay you, to this moment of peace and belonging. Jack's response that day had indeed changed her life forever. Not just by fixing her roof, but by reminding her that she wasn't alone, that Thomas's spirit lived on in the connections they'd built and the lives they'd touched. The house that had once felt too empty now felt just right, filled with memories of the past and possibilities for the future. And Margaret knew, with absolute certainty, that Thomas would be proud. If this story touched your heart today, remember that acts of kindness like Jack's happen every day in communities around the world. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is simply showing up when someone needs us most. Please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that celebrate the human spirit and remind us of the power we all have to change lives. Thank you for watching, and remember, community isn't just where we live, it's how we live, *.